Have you ever imagined a moment when an entire room full of people suddenly falls silent? Not the silence of peace or order, but a heavy, suffocating silence, as if the air itself were being choked by an invisible dread. That's exactly what happened in the Oversight Committee chamber of the House of Representatives on a day no one could forget. There were no resounding claps, no bold proclamations, not even the grand entrances typical of political debates. Instead, every eye was fixed on a man who walked in with a calm so chilling it bordered on eerie, clutching a thick folder stamped in stark red letters, FBI Oversight Briefing. That man was Kash Patel, the newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And today he wasn't there to deliver a speech or spar with words. He was there to unveil a truth powerful enough to shake an entire political career to its core. That room, usually echoing with the roars of lawmakers clashing in partisan battles, was now deathly still. Committee members, from seasoned veterans to fresh faces, sat motionless, their hands resting on copies of the folder none dared to open first. They knew what lay before them wasn't just a routine report. It was a bomb, and when it detonated, there'd be no room for evasion or excuses. The target of this meeting wasn't a street criminal or a corrupt tycoon, but one of their own, Representative Jasmine Crockett. The rising star of the Democratic Party, once hailed as the crown jewel of the progressive movement. Yet today, the dazzling aura she'd once worn like armor seemed to dim, giving way to the dark shadow of accusations no one had dared to fathom. Kash Patel didn't stride in with fanfare or flowery rhetoric. He didn't need to. With a voice low and cold as ice, he began, "Madam Chair, as Director of the FBI, it is my duty to report on the conduct of elected officials that crosses ethical lines, involves financial misconduct, and potentially poses a threat." One sentence, and it was enough to make the room hold its breath. This wasn't a Republican-Democrat slugfest, not the theoretical politics we're used to seeing on TV. This was the system turning its unyielding gaze inward, and at the center of that spotlight stood Jasmine Crockett, no longer a political performer, but an unwilling defendant. Jasmine Crockett, with her meticulously styled hair, camera-ready outfits, and a confident smile that had become her trademark, was once the emblem of a new generation of leaders. Hailing from Texas, she carried the story of a lawyer fighting for justice, a black woman unafraid to confront power. But today there were no cameras in her grasp, no tweets to shape the narrative, no pre-staged drama. Only the stark, unavoidable truth, laid bare by a man unmoved by fame or criticism. Kash Patel. He hadn't come to impress or argue. He'd come to put an end to what he called the abuse of power cloaked his progress. So what brought us to this moment? How did a political star, once celebrated across headlines and social media, become the focal point of a federal investigation? And more crucially, could the halo Crockett had built around herself shield the truth forever? Or was it just a fragile shell, ready to shatter under the light of justice? I invite you to step into this story with me, not just to witness the fall of an individual, but to peer deeper into the system that birthed her and now stood poised to destroy her. This isn't your typical political drama. It's a public trial, where each piece of evidence lands like a hammer blow, its echo impossible to ignore. Picture yourself in that room, feeling the tension in every breath, hearing the rustle of paper as Patel flips through his dossier. This isn't a time to guess who's right or wrong. It's a time to face the question, how loud can someone shout before their own voice is silenced by the truth? For Jasmine Crockett, the answer was drawing near, and it wouldn't come with applause or hashtags. It would come in the terrifying silence of an FBI folder, a silence even her most ardent supporters couldn't break. From that stiflingly silent chamber where Kash Patel laid the FBI dossier on the table like an unspoken verdict, Jasmine Crockett's story began to take sharper shape. This woman, with her piercing gaze and resonant voice, was no stranger. Before the shadow of accusations loomed, she'd been a blazing star in America's political sky. A lawyer, an activist, and above all, a symbol of the progressive movement that Democrats pinned their hopes on. But to grasp why this showdown with Patel became her fateful turning point, we need to rewind to the days when Jasmine Crockett was a beacon of promise, a fire so fierce, no one dared imagine it could soon be snuffed out. Jasmine Crockett stormed into the house like a whirlwind, carrying the power of diversity and unapologetic boldness. A black woman from Texas, she didn't just represent a district, she embodied a generation yearning to see their voices reflected in the halls of power. With a past as a public defender, she proudly recounted her journey, a woman who'd stood up for the downtrodden, now stepping onto a grander stage to take on the titans of American politics. What set Crockett apart, though, wasn't her resume. It was her style. Loud, fearless, and always ready to turn every word into a bullet aimed straight at her foes. Imagine her standing there in a meticulously chosen outfit, her hair perfectly coiled, gripping a microphone like a weapon, each phrase a tweet primed to set social media ablaze. The Democrats saw in her a rare gem, a fresh face who could captivate crowds, especially the young voters weary of aging politicians and dry speeches. She didn't just speak, she roared, she sparred, she turned congressional sessions into high-drama performances. Once, facing off with a Republican in a debate, she unleashed a line that left the room stunned. "I'm not here to play nice with folks who want to crush us. I'm here to fight." Applause erupted, clips spread like wildfire across Twitter, and within hours, Crockett fights rocketed to the top trends. In that moment, she wasn't just a representative, she was a phenomenon, a political star nothing seemed able to stop. Yet behind that dazzling glow, something went unnoticed, or rather something no one wanted to notice. The adoration she garnered from voters and allies didn't stem solely from promises or policies, but from how she turned politics into a stage where she was always the lead. She understood the might of modern media. A well-timed Instagram post could outshine a passed bill. A shocking podcast quip could draw more eyes than a committee meeting. And she wielded that power to the fullest. While colleagues toiled over legislation or met with constituents, Crockett appeared on MSNBC, recorded podcasts, or stood on glitzy event stages, champagne in hand, flashing a victorious smile. She wasn't just building a career, she was crafting a brand, one so radiant it drowned out any questions about her true competence. But the brighter the light, the longer the shadow. Those who cheered her on, from major Democratic donors to loyal social media followers, seemed blind to the fact that Crockett's fame rested on shaky ground. She attended less than 30% of committee hearings, skipped dozens of key votes, and not a single bill she sponsored cleared committee review. But who cared about dry stats when she could set the world buzzing with a single post? Who noticed her rare visits to her district office when her speeches racked up millions of online views? In an era where attention was the ultimate currency, Jasmine Crockett was a master at earning it. And she knew that as long as she held the spotlight, no one would dare peek behind the curtain. Until Kash Patel walked in, with his hefty dossier and unwavering gaze. The moment he sat down and spoke, the room's atmosphere shifted entirely. The silence I described earlier wasn't just the start of a confrontation. It was a sign that Crockett's halo was about to be torn apart. Those who'd seen her as a warrior began to wonder, was she truly a champion of justice, or just a skilled performer polishing her own image? And as Patel flipped through his pages, each piece of Crockett's story emerged, not through her telling, but through cold, undeniable evidence. This was no longer her stage, it was a courtroom, and she was no longer the star, but the one on trial. Imagine you were one of those who cheered her on, hitting like on her every post. How would you feel, knowing that behind those fiery words lay a different truth, one no hashtag could hide? Jasmine Crockett had entered the House vowing to change the system, but now that system was staring back, not with admiration, but with suspicion. And as Patel began his presentation, his steady voice rang out like a death knell, not just for her career, but for the persona she'd so carefully built. This wasn't a tale of a woman crushed by the system. It was the story of a woman who'd pushed that system to its limit, and now had to pay the price. When Kash Patel laid that dossier on the table in the Oversight Committee's hushed chamber, the radiant halo Jasmine Crockett once wore began to falter. She was no longer the invincible political star who turned every word into a social media tidal wave, who drew roars from crowds with her steely declarations. Now, under Patel's icy stare and the weight of the evidence he bore, the image she'd painstakingly crafted, a progressive fighter, a symbol of diversity, was being ripped apart, piece by piece. Gone were the applause, the trending hashtags. All that remained was the dry rustle of pages and the calm voice of a man who hadn't come to debate, but to judge. This wasn't Crockett's stage anymore. It was a public dissection, and what it revealed wasn't a tale of struggle, but a dark portrait of deceit, abuse of power, and words with destruction far beyond their intent. Picture yourself in that room. As Patel's hand pressed the remote, lighting up the large screen behind him, a video flickered to life. Jasmine Crockett, in a dazzling gown, champagne glass in hand, standing on the stage of a human rights campaign gala. She beamed, her voice ringing with confidence. "All I want for my birthday is to take down Elon Musk." The crowd clapped, laughter echoed, and in that moment it was just a quip, a perfect performance for the audience and camera. But then the screen split, and on the right appeared another image. Security footage from a Tesla plant in Texas just 2 days later. A suspicious bag found in the parking lot containing a homemade explosive device, and tucked inside a scrawled note, "Take Elon down." The air in the chamber turned leaden. Patel said nothing at first. He let the silence spread, letting each committee member feel the gravity of what they'd just seen. Then he spoke, his tone even, but sharp as a blade. "Representative Crockett may not have built the bomb herself, but she lit the fuse." Crockett, seated not far away, still clung to her poised exterior, hair flawless, eyes defiant, that signature smirk intact. She shrugged, as if it were a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. "It was just a joke," she replied, her tone light but unable to mask the strain. But Patel didn't let her off that easily. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "So, was Hang Mike Pence a joke? Your party wanted half the country jailed over that one." The room held its breath. This wasn't a debate, it was a direct strike, and Crockett had no escape. Patel pressed on. "We've confirmed multiple social media accounts referencing your speech, your exact words, your image. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's stochastic incitement, reckless speech from an elected official that radicalized others into action. Her words, once her weapon to shine, now turned against her, cutting deep and unrelenting." But that was just the beginning. Patel pressed the remote again, and the screen shifted to a series of internal emails from Crockett's office. One line appeared, sent from her chief of staff to a campaign vendor. "Make sure that clip gets boosted across all platforms. If it hits 200,000 views, the PAC will match funds." Another, brief but chilling, "Cancel the town hall. She's doing an Instagram live with MSNBC tonight, better optics." Patel paused, letting those words sink into everyone present, then said, "This isn't serving constituents. It's serving the algorithm. You're not representing a district, Representative Crockett. You're building a personal media empire. I wonder, if you were a Texas voter who cast a ballot for her, hoping for a voice in Congress, how would you feel, knowing her time was spent chasing views instead of your concerns?" Then came the numbers, receipts no one could deny. Patel held up a stack of papers, his voice unchanged but each sentence a hammer blow. $1,245 for makeup and wardrobe, labeled District Media Prep. $879 at a private DC salon. $3,100 for a 3-night stay at the Line Hotel in Los Angeles, where she recorded a podcast episode promoting her book. He stopped, staring straight at Crockett. "You build taxpayers for self-promotion. This isn't a mistake. It's a deliberate strategy dressed up in buzzwords like community outreach and equity media." Crockett shook her head, a flash of anger in her eyes, but she said nothing. She couldn't. The numbers didn't lie, and they were screaming a truth she couldn't refute. But the heaviest blow came from those who'd once stood by her side. Patel produced a sworn affidavit from a former aide in Crockett's office, his voice steady as he read, "During my time working for Representative Crockett, I was told to prioritize media bookings over constituent services. The atmosphere wasn't about governance. It was about going viral. When I raised concerns, I was told, that's how she wins." The room seemed to freeze. This wasn't an accusation from an enemy. It was a voice from within, from someone who'd trusted her, worked for her. Patel didn't need to add commentary. He let the truth speak. and it echoed louder than any speech Crockett had ever delivered on stage. Imagine being her in that moment, as every eye in the room shifted from admiration to doubt. As your confident smile began to tremble, Jasmine Crockett had entered Congress promising to change the system, but now that system was exposing her, not through slander, but through evidence that couldn't be denied. From inciting rhetoric to lavish spending, from neglecting voters to betrayal by her own staff, it was all laid out by Patel with the cold precision of a prosecutor who knew the case was won. And as he turned each page, the question wasn't whether Crockett could justify herself. It was whether she could survive the storm. This wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the start of a collapse, and its sound rang out not in shouts, but in the terrifying silence of truth. When that irrefutable evidence was laid out by Kash Patel, from the controversial video calling to take down Elon Musk, to the extravagant receipts and chilling testimony from her own former staff, the Oversight Committee chamber ceased to be a place of debate. It had become an arena where Crockett's once dazzling halo was torn apart, revealing a raw truth no tweet could conceal. But if you thought that moment was the peak of her downfall, you haven't seen anything yet, because what followed wasn't Crockett's roar of defiance or the cheers of political foes. It was silence, a terrifying silence, from the very allies who'd once been her staunchest supporters. This wasn't just the end of a performance, it was betrayal, and it cut deeper than any accusation Patel could voice. Imagine you're Jasmine Crockett, sitting there with that defiant gaze still clinging to your face, but inside, your heart races as you realize what's happening. The people who'd stood by you, clapped for your fiery speeches, shared your posts across social media, they're gone now. Not one member of the squad, the progressive lawmakers famed for their unity, spoke up for her. No tweet from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, no encouragement from Ilhan Omar. Instead, they sat still, eyes downcast, as if she'd become a ghost they refused to acknowledge. The Democratic Party, which had once hailed her as a new star, a symbol of diversity and strength, turned its back with dizzying speed. That silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a declaration. An invisible knife plunged straight into her back. Then words began to emerge, not in defense, but in condemnation. Representative Abigail Spanberger, a seasoned Democrat from Virginia, broke the quiet with a statement short but sharp as a blade. I support transparency, I support integrity, but I don't support members turning Congress into a podcast stage. Those words rang like a death knell, not just for Crockett, but for the image she'd built. Next came Jared Golden from Maine, a man unafraid to challenge his own party. This isn't about gender or race, it's about accountability. But the final blow, the one that rocked the room, came from Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic House leader. He offered no excuses, no cover, just a cold line. The committee must be allowed to do its job. No protection, no solidarity, just the ruthless pragmatism of politics. And Crockett was now a pawn sacrificed. The fallout hit like a storm. Within hours of Patel's closing remarks, the House Ethics Committee called an emergency session. No delays, no hesitation. They voted. And with a tally of 230 and 179, Jasmine Crockett was stripped of all committee privileges. Picture that scene. She stood, still clinging to her pride, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "This is fascism in disguise," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "You're trying to silence a strong black woman." But no one rose with her. Even Ilhan Omar, who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder with her in political battles, stayed silent, her gaze averted as if unwilling to be tainted. Crockett's fate was sealed, not by enemies, but by those she'd once called allies. And then, like a final slash, the Department of Justice stepped in. A brief statement was issued. "We have received official documentation from the House regarding Representative Jasmine Crockett. An investigation is underway." No lengthy explanation, no leniency, just the legal machinery grinding into motion, indifferent to the social justice cries she'd once championed. Imagine being her, standing alone in that now empty room as the stage lights dimmed, the applause of old replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. This wasn't a defeat. It was a total collapse. And the deepest wound wasn't Patel's accusations, but the betrayal of those she'd trusted. I wonder if you were one of the voters who cast a ballot for Crockett, believing she'd bring change, how would you feel watching this unfold? Her allies' silence wasn't just abandonment, it was proof that in politics, loyalty lasts only as long as you're worth. Jasmine Crockett had been a star, a blazing fire the Democrats hoped would light their path. But when that fire became an uncontrollable blaze, they didn't extinguish it. They let it burn out, and as she stood there, alone and exposed, the question wasn't whether she could recover, it was whether she'd ever truly been who they thought. The truth, as Patel proved, didn't need to shout to win, it just needed to be revealed, and the silence of those who'd once adored her said it all. As the footsteps of her former allies faded down the House corridors, leaving Jasmine Crockett alone in that empty chamber, the silence was no longer a warning. It had become her final sentence. No squad to shield her, no Democratic Party to hoist her banner, no rallying cries from the crowds that once hailed her as an unyielding warrior. The Ethics Committee's decision to strip her committee roles, paired with the DOJ's curt announcement of an impending investigation, marked the end of a journey once bathed in glory. But this wasn't a scripted finale with applause or tearful farewells. It was a quiet, frigid, irreversible collapse. Jasmine Crockett wasn't felled by foes, she destroyed herself. And now, as the stage lights faded, her story left behind not just ashes, but a larger question for us all. Imagine standing in her shoes, the microphone, once her mightiest weapon, lying mute on the table, no one left to hear. She tried one last time to speak, in a half-empty press room with a handful of lingering reporters, her voice still grasping at pride but quivering beneath. This is a coordinated attack on my name, my identity, and everything I stand for. I will not resign. She punched each word, as if they could summon back her golden days, but even she didn't believe it anymore. No reply came, no applause. Just the scratch of reporters' pens and the cold wind through an open door. This wasn't a drama she could direct, it was reality, and reality didn't care for victimhood pleas or ringing slogans. For the next 12 minutes, she spoke of oppression, of dirty politics, but not once did she address the receipts, the internal emails, or her staff's testimony. She couldn't, because truth doesn't need to shout to triumph. It just stands there, silent and indelible. Then, like a final thrust, the system she'd once exploited struck back. The Ethics Committee's final report dropped on a Thursday morning, unceremonious but razor-sharp. Representative Jasmine Crockett has demonstrated a consistent pattern of ethical violations, financial mismanagement, and conduct unbecoming a member of Congress. The recommendation: refer the case to the DOJ for criminal review, suspend all legislative duties. By noon, every major outlet blared the headline, "Crockett faces criminal charges, House acts." The woman who'd once dominated Twitter trends was no longer trending. She was under federal scrutiny, and no hashtag could save her now. I wonder if you were one of those who believed in her, who saw her as a flame of change. How would you feel witnessing this end? It wasn't Republicans or political enemies who pushed her into the abyss. Her own choices did that. Kash Patel, with his cool demeanor and thick dossier, wasn't her destroyer. He was the mirror forcing her to face herself. But this story isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's a warning to a system that's too long indulged political stars who turn Congress into a stage and voters into an audience. We, the watchers, bear some blame for letting noise drown out integrity, for letting views replace duty. Picture the final scene: Crockett before her district office, now ringed by protesters, not political rivals, but the very voters who'd elected her. They held signs, "We want truth, not theater." Former donors sent letters demanding her resignation. Papers that once praised her turned to critique. Even the New York Times, a voice that had backed her, conceded the Crockett experiment was always fragile, and now it's shattered. She wasn't ruined by the system, she was ruined by her own arrogance, by the belief that her halo could hide everything forever. And Kash Patel? He didn't linger to gloat or revel. He simply walked away, leaving behind a lesson none could ignore. In politics, you can shout as loud as you like, but when truth speaks, everything else falls silent. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the victim of a plot. She was the architect of her own ruin. And as the House doors closed behind her, the only sound left wasn't applause, but the click of justice's latch. sealing shut a chapter she'd thought would last forever. This wasn't the end of a star, it was the start of an awakening, and it belongs to us all.